your hands. I should be able to see your hands raised and I can be able to call you when needed. With that, we're going to get started. I'd like to start off with on a sad note. Many of you know on October 22nd, Lee Anderson, former council member, Science Center member, he's passing. Lee was a valued participant in the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Council process for almost the entirety of the council's 47-year history. He was one of 3 economists appointed to the council's Scientific and Statistical Committee when he was first formed in 1976. He was later appointed to the council, holding council's obligatory seat from 1986 to 95 and 2007 to 2016. Lee served for 3 years as council chair and a total of 10 years as vice chair. He participated in numerous council committees, 7 of which he chaired at different times. After his departure from the council in 2016, Lee was reappointed to the SSC and served until early 2023. He was also my predecessor before I became on the council. With that, can I have a moment of silence to remember his family at this time of year? Thank you, everyone. With that, Chris, would you like to introduce our next group that's going to be doing some work for us?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a brief announcement and then a quick introduction before we get started with the board. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, we'll be taking the council picture photo, so prepare yourself for that. Show up here at 9 o'clock, and then Mary will tell us where that photo is going to be. The second, I'd like to introduce some folks. I think everyone in the room recognizes that the council's been involved with climate change, fisheries governance work. We recently completed our climate scenario planning work this year. We've contracted with the Parnin Group to review and identify potential ways to improve our process, basically do a program review. Our process as it relates to developing federal fishery management regulations, particularly in regard to responding to climate change and fishery-related challenges, associated fishery-related challenges. If you're interested in what the project's all about, there's a summary of it behind the executive director's report in the briefing book. 3 individuals are here with us today: Brett Weedoff, Duncan Wood, Chris Hawkins. They'll be here today and tomorrow. Over the next couple months, we'll be reaching out to a number of folks to gather information and seek input in how best to develop fishery management actions. So with that, I'd like to introduce Brett. Brett, if you'd like to say a few words before we get started, it'd be great. Welcome.
Good morning, council members. My name is Brett Weedoff from the Parnin Group. To my left is Duncan Wood from the Parnin Group, and to my right is Dr. Chris Hawkins from Linker. We're really happy to be here and work with you all. I really appreciate Mr. Moore contracting with us to take a look at the fisheries management system here. We are no stranger to that. Dr. Hawkins and I have been council staff. We've also been federal employees in Pacific Islands Regional Office. Mr. Wood here has experience in examining programs and looking at streamlining and making things more efficient. So we're really happy, and we think that we have a breadth of experience here that we could take a look at what's happening in your system and maybe come up with some new ways of business if possible. And also incorporate some new information that's coming down the line from climate change and impacts of that. So we're just wanted to put names with faces. We're going to be around here for another day and a half, so we'd like to meet with some folks. What we're going to be doing in the next couple months is creating some focus groups, meeting with some of you all, some of the commission folks, some of the people who are council members, and a lot of others that are involved in this fishery management process. So we're going to be starting to look at what things are concerning you in the fishery management process, what maybe we could come up with to improve and streamline. So you'll be hearing from us, and hopefully you'll be able to provide us with the expertise. And the one last thing is, I have learned over the years as a manager of fisheries is none of us is smarter than all of us. So we are going to lean on all of you and all the folks that you work with to come up with some solutions and ideas to move this regulatory streamlining or incorporating climate change down the line. So that's the goal here, is to work with you all. We are experts in our field, but you all have great expertise as well, so we can collectively come together and try to move this ball forward. So we are here for some Q&A if you'd like. Otherwise, we'll be around and we can meet and greet.
And I'll just add that we look forward over the next 12 months or so to solving some of the foundational challenges that have existed since 1976.
All right, thank you. With that, keep our meeting moving. We will reach out, during breaks and on lunch and anybody. We also have a hospitality tonight that hopefully you three will show up to. And I'm sure there'll be a lot, you'll be bombarded with questions. And with that, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's move on now to our summer flounder commercial mesh size regulations and exemptions. As a presentation by Kylie Dancy and Hannah, I assume, both Mid-Atlantic Council staff, and Andy Loftus from Mid-Atlantic Fisheries Management Council contractor. Go ahead, Kylie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So there are a couple issues that council staff and Andy Loftus have been working on over the last couple months. 3 commercial summer flounder mesh issues, including the first one being the summer flounder commercial minimum mesh size of 5.5-inch diamond or 6-inch square. There are 2 exemptions to the minimum mesh size that Andy has been working with the council on evaluating, and that includes the small mesh exemption program and the fly net exemption. So I'm going to start, after these couple overview slides, I'm going to start with my presentation on the commercial minimum mesh size, which is something that has been primarily council staff working on that. And then we could have some discussion about that issue. And then Andy will come give some presentation and information on his report on the 2 exemptions. These are all issues that the council and board annually review during the specifications process. Typically, there's not a lot of discussion on these issues, but this represents some more in-depth analysis that we've conducted to address some previously discussed concerns with these issues. So we've been working on this for a few months. In the summer, during the specification setting process for 24 and 25, we did have some preliminary discussions on these issues with the monitoring committee, advisory panel, and the council and the board, sort of giving an overview of what we were looking at. We continued to analyze these issues into the fall and had some discussions with some industry folks, including also opening a public comment web forum that was open from mid-October to mid-November. We held a public input webinar on November 1st that targeted any fishery participants that might be impacted by any of these regulations, including not only the summer flounder commercial trawl fishery, but also participants in other fisheries that might be utilizing the small mesh exemption program and or the fly net exemption. We had the monitoring committee discuss this on November 13th and provide some feedback and recommendations. And we also had a brief discussion of this at the December 4th advisory panel meeting. We were a little bit limited for time on that advisory panel discussion, and the comments that we received were pretty much in line with the previous comments that we had received through the other comment opportunities. So we didn't specifically separate that input into a separate portion of the presentation. So everything is kind of combined input on these issues. So the objectives of the discussion today are to consider whether to make any changes or to pursue additional work to consider changes in the future. Some of the changes could be made through specifications to all 3 of these issues, but depending on the degree of change or the type of change, some of the changes might require a framework action and addendum. So for each issue, the council and board could consider whether to make no changes. Some specific changes could be adopted at this meeting if it is something that is within the range of what can be modified through specifications, and we can talk more about that as we go through the issues. It's possible that if there are small requests for additional information, we could try to bring these issues back for reconsideration in August when we do the 2025 specifications review. But more likely, if there is further analysis needed, a framework action or addendum may be the most appropriate way to ensure that we get sufficient time and resources dedicated to further analysis and make sure that gets prioritized. So the council and board could initiate an action to further consider changes to any one of these 3 issues or some combination of the 3. So I'll go through the summer flounder commercial minimum mesh size background and information. The current regulations require a minimum mesh size of either 5.5-inch diamond or 6-inch square. These regulations have been in place since Amendment 2 in 1993. At the time, there was limited information about square mesh selectivity for summer flounder, but there was a recognition that the square mesh regulation needed to be larger than the diamond mesh. So the equivalency of the 6-inch square and the 5.5-inch diamond was based on a couple sources of information, including information from Amendment 4 to the Northeast Multispecies FMP. There was a selectivity study for winter flounder comparing diamond mesh and square mesh selectivity. And then there was also a square mesh experiment in Canada. So there's some more information about those and what was used from those and links to that information in the briefing document. The council funded a mesh size study several years back led by Emerson Hasbrook and his team at Cornell. And the results of the study indicated that the 5.5-inch diamond and the 6-inch square may not be equivalent in terms of selectivity for summer flounder. The 6-inch square in the results of the study appeared to function closer to a 5-inch diamond mesh in terms of the selectivity. So the Summer Flounder Scup and Black Sea Bass Monitoring Committee, when previously discussing this issue, had flagged some concerns about potentially higher catch of undersized summer flounder with the 6-inch square mesh. And based on those recommendations, the council and board had decided to prioritize this evaluation, basically looking at this in a little bit more detail and seeking feedback on the use of and/or the need for the square mesh regulations and whether we should consider phasing that out or modifying that regulation. So there's just a quick visual of the study results from that 2018 study. This shows the selectivity curves of a couple different mesh sizes that were tested, with the horizontal axis showing the length of summer flounder and the vertical axis showing the probability of retention. So the vertical red line is the commercial minimum fish size of 14 inches. So the mesh sizes highlighted in yellow are the current regulatory options, and you can see that the 5-inch diamond and 6-inch square curves are pretty similar, and the length at 50% retention for those is very close, basically overlapping. So that 5-inch diamond and 6-inch square are retaining about 50% of summer flounder just below the minimum fish size. And then to the right of that, you see the 5.5-inch diamond curve, which is one of our current regulations, shows a slightly different selectivity pattern versus the 6-inch square. And then 6-inch diamond, not surprisingly, retains more larger fish compared to the other tested sizes. There was only one square mesh option tested in the studies, and that was the 6-inch square. So there's no other square mesh comparisons here. So staff started looking at some observer data from looking at observed trawl hulls from 2007 to 2022, using trawl year records where summer flounder was identified as the primary target species. And over that time period, it shows about 68% of the hulls used diamond mesh and about 31% used square mesh. So this is indicating, a pretty good portion of the fishery or vessels that are targeting or catching summer flounder are using square mesh. Using the same observers data set, we also looked at the measured mesh size distribution among the hulls using square mesh. This is from the observer data where the observer selects, I think, 10 meshes and measures them and takes an average, and that's recorded in the observer data. So we see that most of those for this data set fall within either the 5.5 to 6 range or the 6 to 6.5 inch categories for square mesh. So a good number of hulls using mesh sizes that might be measuring a bit below that 6-inch square requirement. We did the same for diamond mesh, and most of the hulls using either a 5 to 5.5 or 5.5 to 6-inch mesh, so slightly smaller compared to the square mesh, which is what you would expect with a smaller measurement associated with that regulation. We also looked at the total poundage of observed harvest and discards over this entire time period using the square, the diamond mesh, and the various size categories. So these follow similar patterns as the two slides. So most of the landings with diamond mesh are between 5 and 6-inch diamond mesh, and most landings with square mesh are 5.5 to 6.5 inches. So overall, the observed discards in terms of the poundage for all of these categories was pretty low. We did look at discards as a percent of the catch in aggregate over all of these years. So this isn't haul by haul information. This is just summing all the discards and catch over the whole data set. So this is more of a rough analysis, and something more comprehensive, like the monitoring committee suggested, maybe looking at a CPUE analysis to do something similar, but that would take a bit more time to figure out how to do that. This doesn't show the magnitude of discards in each category, just the percent of the catch. And there are some slight differences in these percentages by mesh type and size, but overall they're fairly low with the exception of the smallest size bin, which you would expect. But in that bin, there's pretty limited amounts of discards there to begin with. And then, as I said in the last slide, overall, the magnitude of discards in the observed data here was pretty low relative to the harvest for all of these categories. So in our public feedback that we received through written comments and verbal comments and discussions with folks that wanted to comment on this issue, we didn't receive quite as many comments on the commercial minimum mesh as we did the exemptions, but overall, folks commented about what might influence their choice of mesh type, and that can be influenced by state regulations, personal preference, maybe different target species, anticipated non-target species. Some folks are saying that certain mesh types help avoid certain non-target species that may be in the area they're fishing. And bottom type, for example, I think we got a comment saying that square mesh sheds mud better, so might be used more commonly in a muddier bottom situation. So we did get some information about what might influence that choice of square versus diamond. There was a lot of concern about the costs that were associated with any changes to the mesh requirements. So the net replacements, we got kind of a large ballpark range, depending on whether you're talking about just replacing the cod end or the whole net. Can cost tens of thousands of dollars. Can be very expensive, basically, to replace these nets. And we did also receive some information that the 6-inch square nets are still being specifically ordered and purchased recently, and those represent large investments. And so any change would result in a significant financial burden to those that have purchased those net types. Most of the commenters, the vast majority of people speaking to this issue, supported no changes to the current minimum mesh requirements. We did get some commenters noting that the 6-inch square does reduce discards and helps to retain market-sized fish. There was one suggestion to investigate a larger square mesh option. And there was also a recommendation to implement a 5-inch mesh from November through April for summer flounder, scup, and black sea bass. But the vast majority of comments that we got on this were just essentially saying no change was needed, and that there's no concerns with these mesh regulations at this time. So sort of combining the monitoring committee comments and the staff recommendations, there's a staff recommendation in the cover memo for this issue and a monitoring committee summary as well. The monitoring committee and staff recommend no changes to the minimum mesh regulations at this time. Again, noting that the square mesh is still commonly used in this fishery, and removal would impose a substantial financial burden on the industry participants. There is not enough evidence at this time to suggest that a change is warranted. And if we did want to make a change to that square mesh regulation, there is limited data on which to identify an appropriate alternative square mesh size. The monitoring committee did discuss that, if you increase the square mesh size, that would be expected to decrease discards of undersized summer flounder, but also we don't have any real information on, exactly to what degree that would happen and whether it's worth the trade-off of the high cost to industry, as well as what would the impact of that be on the retention of legal sized fish. So essentially not quite enough information to recommend a change, and recommended leaving those measures as is for now. The monitoring committee did support consideration of adding additional mesh size studies as a possible research priority, and particularly for looking at a range of different square mesh options. The monitoring committee also noted that if the council and board do consider changes either now or in the future, they would recommend a longer phase-in time to help alleviate the costs to industry, so more in line with sort of the lifespan, the average expected lifespan of new nets, which I think we heard was, depending on how you treat them, maybe 7 to 10 years for well cared for nets. And that could be used to inform any potential phase-in period if there is a modification at some point. They also recommended additional evaluation of the biological and economic impacts if any changes are desired. So I think that's all I have for this issue. So happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Question for Kylie? Did a great job. Okay, people, how would we like to proceed now? All right, with that as status quo, we don't have to do any action at all. All right, with that, Jeff Kalen?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. What about the idea of a framework to change the definition of the small mesh exemption program as was recommended by some of the advisors? Is that being recommended by the staff to move ahead with a framework? And would that be on the list of priorities? Because I think that's something that council should probably look at. And my other question is, can the definitional change be made through specs, the more than two seams and so forth that we've been reading about for the last couple of weeks? I'm just not clear where we are in terms of process. Thank you.
I don't think we've quite come to that yet, but Kylie?
Yeah, so sorry, I should have maybe mentioned that we were going to pause for discussion of the minimum mesh size issue first. And then Andy has a presentation on the exemptions and we could discuss those changes. We can provide more information on
Sorry,
potential changes.
reading ahead.
Next.
Chris Moore?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I'm glad we had the opportunity to talk about mesh regulations today. For many years, probably since the 90s, we've been talking about mesh, maybe probably the 80s, mesh regulations for summer flounder. So we thought it's a good time for us to basically have a contractor and others look at the subject and see where we needed to go with it. So based on everything that we have in front of us now, it doesn't really seem to be a problem. Right? So, we kind of park as such, therefore, we're going to park that particular subject for a while. But if in fact resources do become available, if in fact we have some indication that we're having a problem with summer flounder discards in the directed fishery for summer flounder using that particular mesh, then I think our next step would be to do the research, figure out exactly what the right mesh size is. But based on everything we could tell right now, to summarize everything that Kylie said to you today, you don't have to do anything. So now's your chance to say, Chris, you're wrong. And in fact, we need to do something else. Thanks.
Michelle Duval?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So not going to say, Dr. Moore, you're wrong. Just wanted to, with respect to the monitoring committee's recommendation to, add this to the research priorities, I think, is it next year that we're going to have a comprehensive review of our research priorities. So we wouldn't necessarily need any action by the council to fold this recommendation in. I assume it would automatically be picked up. I see Brandon nodding in the back, so I'll stop talking. Thank you.
Going to go online. Emerson Hasbrook?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. I was having problems with my audio before, so glad you can hear me. Yeah, I had my hand up for two things. One is I was wondering if there were any specific suggestions in terms of what size square mesh to possibly look at in the future. That was part one. And part two, I think, has already been kind of answered by Chris as well as the question that Michelle asked. And so I was going to ask if we needed to have a motion to have this considered as a future research priority. But I'm guessing from the response to Michelle was that we don't.
No, we don't. Kylie?
Yeah, Emerson, just to your first question about the alternative square mesh sizes, I think the idea of 6.5 was floated, but that's the only one I heard specifically.
Any more questions or comments for Kylie? And is anyone else having computer problems besides me? Okay, all right. Bobby?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things I looked briefly at the study that was done before, and I would press if a new study is done, that it needs to be a broader range, because the effectiveness of square mesh versus diamond mesh will change. It is area dependent, if it's an inshore or offshore fishery. So I'm not advocating for any particular mesh size, but the test area needs to be fairly broad because the interaction with the fish in in that configuration will change depending if it's a slower inshore fishery or if it's a more directed offshore fishery, if it's a winter fishery versus summer fishery. So the utility does change slightly. So that would be the only recommendation I would have. Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else? Kylie, are you done with your presentation?
Yes, and
Okay.
Andy's presentation is a separate PowerPoint. If we could pull that up.
So I guess when we get that loaded up, Andy, whenever you're ready.
So while it's loading up, I'll just mention, I'm going to go through there's two parts to this presentation. The first part is a small mush exemption program. I'm going to pause after I finish the small mush exemption program just for any clarifying questions. But please hold the discussion until after the fly net exemption program, because I think the discussion needs to occur with both the programs in mind. So there will be a slight pause if you have any questions about the material that I present. So we were asked to look at the small mesh exemption and fly net exemption programs in the context of how are they being applied and are there any recommendations or advice that should be offered to improve those for the future, and particularly working with industry on doing this. So the small mesh exemption program, just as a quick history, was developed under Amendment 2 to the FMP in 1993, and then just modified very slightly under Amendment 3. It was suggested by the New England Fishery Management Council and really was designed to allow vessels to retain some of the catch or bycatch of summer flounder while they were operating in small fisheries, small mesh fisheries offshore. And in that area, in the particular area where the small mesh exemption program applies, the smaller summer flounder were not being caught in any great abundance. And so it didn't appear to be a problem in terms of the conservation goals or protecting those small summer flounder. So in a nutshell, this is the small mesh exemption program. Vessels that are fishing east of longitude 72 degrees 30 west from November 1st to April 30th. While using a mesh smaller than the standard 5.5-inch diameter 6-inch square that Kylie talked about, may land more than 200 pounds of summer flounder. So that's it in a nutshell. It's not a very complicated exemption program. And graphically, this is the area currently where the small mesh exemption program applies east of that line. Administratively, the small mesh exemption program requires a letter of authorization issued by GARFO and participation for at least 7 days. And during that time, vessels cannot fish west of the line while participating in the program. We'll come back to that statement here in a little bit. So GARFO may rescind the exemption if the vessels fishing under the program are discarding more than 10% of their summer flounder catch. And that's the wording in regulation. The wording in the FMP is slightly different. And we'll discuss that very quickly in a couple of minutes. So in terms of utilization, there are approximately 75 letters of authorization issued each year, and most of those are active. And active is a relative term, as you'll see in both of these presentations. Most of the information we have is coming from anecdotal, I shouldn't say anecdotal, but inferred or assumed information from data. So active is really indicating what mesh size the people are indicating that they're using who have been issued an LOA. Yep, there we go. So approximately 6% of the observer trips met the criteria for an assumed small mess exemption program trip. And that includes the area fish, the gear fish, the pounds landed, and discarded more than 10% of their summer flounder catch. Using the methodology that was basically in place since 1993 and stated in the FMP. This hasn't really changed significantly over time in the 30 years since the small mush exemption program has been in place. They've never met that 10% level for rescinding the exemption. Again, using the methodology that they adopted in the early years. The number of vessels participating and the percent of trips observed meeting the criteria have remained relatively stable over time. And just graphically, this is the number of vessels that are participating in the program. You can see, it's varied between, I think we had a low of 55 in 2014 and we're up to 75, but there's no real big trend up or down in the LOAs that are issued year to year. So industry feedback, first and foremost, the small mush exemption program has become critically important to the industry, particularly in the southern New England fleets. And in their opinion, it has successfully reduced regulatory discards. Their overwhelming recommendation from industry is to move the line of demarcation approximately 5 miles westward to align the line roughly with the northeast corner of the SCUP Southern Gear Restricted Area. Graphically, in red here, you'll see that that would be the area, if the line were to be moved, that would be the area that they were discussing. The blue area is the coral reef exclusion zone. So in terms of area, it's approximately 5,000 square kilometers or 1,900 square miles that it would add to the existing exemption area. Okay, not advancing. There we go. Some observations or recommendations. There is the discrepancy that I mentioned between the language in the FMP and the language in the regulations for determining the point for rescinding the exemption. But I'll emphasize before you talk about that very much, that can be corrected if some of the data sources are updated and modified. The current analysis, again, as I mentioned, relies almost exclusively on assumptions of whether an observed trip is fishing under the SMEP through a series of steps that I won't go into. And so, there's a possibility of updating. We don't necessarily have the same data sources available now. We have more data sources available now than were available in 1993, and certainly technology to match up those data sources. So there's a possibility that we can really update the information and work off of actual data as opposed to assumed data. Some monitoring committee feedback supportive of the further evaluation of the proposal to change the line. However, I think the monitoring committee has stated that additional analysis is certainly needed to determine what the impacts of moving that line actually will be, and particularly in terms of the number of small summer flounder that would be encountered and discarded in the fishery if it were to be moved approximately 5 miles to the west. And again, as I mentioned, we suggest that exploring new methods of analysis and data sources to help evaluate the use of the exemption should be looked into. The evaluation methods could be modernized, expanded. You know, we weren't able to connect data sets as quickly and easily in 1993 as we are today. Of course, today we have, electronic vessel trip reports submitted within 48 hours of landing that could potentially be utilized. So there's some things that could be explored, again, to use actual data as opposed to assumed observer data to get a better handle on, how this exemption is being used and applied in landings and discards. Administratively, there is some confusion. It became clear during the process of talking individually and as a group with industry members that the requirement that vessels fishing under a letter of authorization shall not fish west of the line. There's a couple of interpretations. The regulatory interpretation is that no fishing west of the line at all while enrolled in the program. But some of the industry interpretation that we heard was that no fishing west of the line during a single trip could be conducted. So, for example, you could have an LOA, go out fishing east of the line under the exemption, come back, switch gears, and then go out on another trip for another species west of the line the next day. So there's some confusion there. GARFO is aware of that, and I think that's an administrative matter, communications matter that GARFO can work on directly with industry. Nothing that I think the council needs to be concerned with. Staff recommendations for the small mesh exemption program. Staff supports the additional analysis of the industry proposed change in the exempted area, particularly the biological impacts of moving it approximately 5 miles to the west. The regulatory language appears to restrict the adjustments that can occur through specifications. There's a huge long paragraph that is very convoluted about how you can change through specifications the area. But in a nutshell, you can change it by 30-minute intervals and 2-week intervals. But anything beyond that really requires more detailed analysis and action. So there's not a lot that you can do in terms of changing the line through specifications in a quick way. Continuing on with the staff recommendations, more complex area changes, if they are desired, should be evaluated through a framework or addendum to ensure ensure that sufficient staff resources and expertise are dedicated to making this happen. Consider how the area interacts with the SCUP GRAs and the deep sea coral areas, and should consider adding one or both exemption issues to a framework to reconsider SCUP GRAs on the council's 2024 implementation plan. So I want to pause here just for any clarifying questions. Again, I think discussion, please hold the discussion until after the fly net exemption presentation. But any questions about the material that was just presented?
Any questions for Andy? Eric Reed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So talking about possibly a framework. So what's the process here? What's the quickest way to give me an early Christmas present? I suppose that's what I would be asking for at this point. But do we initiate a framework for both topics, which was mentioned? And we have to put that on our priority list on Thursday?
I think we hold off till we see the fly net stuff, Eric, and then we'll get everything together.
Okay.
John Clark?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a clarification on the regulation right now. If the fisherman with an LOA is fishing in the exempt area, they can't fish west of that line, but they could go out for a day and just fish west of the line and Is that what they're saying? Is there any reporting requirement to say I'm fishing under the LOA or I'm not fishing under the LOA on a given day?
No, that's where I think some of the confusion comes in. If you look at the way the regulation is written and the way I think that Garfo is interpreting it, that if you have an LOA, you cannot fish west of the line, period, during the time when you have an LOA. The other interpretation I think that some individuals have is if you have an LOA and you go fishing east of the line one day, you can come back in, for example, switch over gears and then go fishing west of the line in another fishery. And so that's where the confusion happens. And, you know, I think it's something that Garfo's aware of it and you know, can act upon clarifying it with industry.
Adam?
As part of this process, was a review of the administrative record during decision-making done, looking at meeting minutes to see what the intent was at the time of that decision?
Garfo did some of that. We didn't look specifically back at meeting minutes for in the lead up to the development of the FMP.
Any more questions? Andy, I did not see any more. You want to continue on with the FlyNet exemption?
Yep. Okay. Okay, so on with the FlyNet exemption, similar history to the small mesh exemption. It was implemented in 1993 under Amendment 2. And basically, the FlyNet exemption indicates that vessels fishing with two-seam otter trough fly net specifically defined are exempt from the summer flounder minimum mesh size requirements. That specific definition, again, in regulation of a fly net is that is a two-seam otter trawl with the following configuration. The net has a large mesh webbing in the wings with a stretch mesh measure of 8 to 64 inches. The first or belly section of the net consists of 35 meshes or more of 8-inch stretch mesh webbing or larger. And that in the body section of the net, the stretch mesh decreases in size relative to the wings and continues to decrease throughout the extensions to the cod end, which generally has a webbing of 2-inch stretch mesh. I'll note while this definition is up there, it's a very, very specific definition, and it was developed and designed specifically to accommodate a fishery at the time centered in North Carolina, but with some landings occurring up to Cape Henlopen, I believe. Focused on Atlantic croaker, weakfish, Atlantic mackerel, and bluefish. So the exemption really was designed, and the definition of the fly net was designed around around that fishery. In terms of utilization, because it was designed around North Carolina, all of the analysis or the data that's been looked at over the years has really focused in on the utilization of it in the North Carolina fisheries. And it's decreased to the point now where basically there are no summer flounder that have been landed in this fishery in recent years. And a number of reasons for that, but I think one thing that everybody points to is you know, the closure, if you will, to large vessels of you know, one of the major ports down in North Carolina. So that's probably one of the major reasons that it has declined over the years. However, you know, the public comments from industry, both before we started this process and certainly, you know, as you went through this process, indicate that the fly net exemption is being utilized to fish with high-rise nets that probably don't meet that specific regulatory definition in many cases in states other than North Carolina. This is substantiated by some observer data. We can look at you know, observer data where they have recorded either fly nets with 2 seams, fly nets with 4 seams, fly nets with seams unknown, and then of course a variety of other gear. But those are the fly net categories in the observer data, and we do pick that up in areas outside of North Carolina. As with the small mesh exemption, there is a little bit of a regulatory discrepancy between the regulatory language and the FMP language. In the FMP, it stipulates that NIMS may withdraw the exemption if the annual average summer flounder catch in the fly net fishery exceeds 1% of the total fly net catch. The current federal regulations indicate that vessels fishing under the exemption on average are discarding more than 1% of their entire catch of summer flounder per trip. So it's a small, it's a small difference in the wording, but it does have an implication in terms of how you measure it. But again, with the small mesh, as with the small mesh exemption, before you get wrapped around the axle too much on this, and I think this actually is an issue that Garfo can handle, but you might want to talk about the big issues of what you do with the fly net exemption and the small mesh exemption programs before you start worrying about that language too much. Industry feedback, as with the small mesh exemption program, very, very strong support for keeping the fly net exemption. It provides tremendous flexibility to switch between fisheries like summer flounder, scup, black sea bass, and squid. The industry indicated that the high-rise net is really a regional terminology for a fly net, even if the fly nets aren't meeting that strict regulatory definition, particularly in the context of the mesh size in the wings and number of seams and things like that. An industry didn't indicate that there were any differences in fishing characteristics between what they are calling high-rise nets and the fly nets as defined in regulation. Continuing on with the feedback, the industry indicates that the definition of the fly net should be updated to reflect more of the the current application of fly net exemption. Specifically that the fly nets must have at least 2 seams as opposed to specifying exactly 2 seams. So that would allow the 4 seam nets, for example, to be compliant. To increase take off the cap, if you will, of the mesh size in the wings. Currently, the mesh size is in the wings is indicated as 8 to 64 inches. And so industry indicates that should basically specify greater than 8 inches and just leave the 64-inch cap off. Other suggestions, and these were suggestions that were made when we went up back to industry for some clarification on some of the recommendations after the monitoring committee had already met. So I just wanted to indicate that the monitoring committee hasn't seen these, at least for discussion during their meeting. Industry recommended that high-rise, the word high-rise be added to the fly net definition, become a high-rise and fly net exemption. Again, removal of the number of meshes, 35 or more in the belly of the net. So just to indicate that. And then clarification that the stretch mesh decreases to the extension of the cod end. So that basically is modifying Part C of the regulatory definition. So the monitoring committee, they concluded that the exemption is not being used in the fishery in the area in which it was originally intended. Again, North Carolina, specifically fly net fishery down there. Monitoring committee agreed that the regulatory definition update may be needed to reflect how it's being applied today. However, the committee also agreed that we need to better understand what the implications are of expanding the fly net definition so that it doesn't inadvertently perhaps increase the utilization of the exemption in other areas. So basically saying we need to look at this more closely. And then there's a need to consider the use of additional data sets in the future to evaluate the use of the exemption. I don't think I mentioned with the fly net, there is no permit requirement. There is no reporting requirement specifically for fly nets. But I will note that both with fly nets and small mesh exemption, although we don't have actual data about how they're necessarily being utilized, all of the fish that are harvested are being accounted for through the regular reporting, the electronic vessel trip reports, for example, that commercial operators are required to do. So it's all being accounted for. It's just that you can't specifically say this came from utilization of the FlyNet exemption. As I mentioned, administratively, we think that Garofol can handle the discrepancy in the FMP language and the regulatory language. So again, that's nothing that I think that the council really needs to address. Observations, recommendations, again, the original intent of the regulation to accommodate specific use of a specific gear in a specific area is no longer being utilized. Again, seeing no landings of summer flounder in North Carolina flynet fishery in several years. There's really no data to evaluate the extent to which this exemption is being applied or used in other areas with non-compliant gear, and that, I use that term loosely, but gear that doesn't meet that specific regulatory definition. And again, there's no permitting or reporting required that would allow us to make that analysis. In terms of recommendations, staff recommendations, as noted by the monitoring committee, the definition is likely to need to be reconsidered. There does need to be additional analysis to assess where and how and when the exemption is being used, and to evaluate the implications of changing or expanding the definition. And a framework action or addendum is recommended if the council board want to pursue these changes. And then I would just conclude by saying, these two exemptions are very closely tied together. If you expand, for example, the FlyNet exemption to the definition as recommended by industry, there really, in many cases, would be very little use for the small mesh exemption program because you could be fishing under the FlyNet exemption program. So they are very closely tied, and they should be considered together in a framework document. So with that, that concludes both the FlyNet and the small mesh exemption program information, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Andy. Mike Penning.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Andy, for the presentation and the work of the monitoring committee. Mr. Chairman, I have a motion that I'm prepared to make that might help focus discussion, but I didn't know if you wanted to first see if there's any clarifying questions for Andy, or get my motion on the table first, whatever is your preference.
Let's go ahead and put the motion on.
Okay, thanks. Then I move to consider as a potential 2024 priority a framework adjustment to clarify the definition of a FlyNet and to consider moving the western boundary of the small mesh exemption area. The intent of this framework is to be completed in April 2024 for implementation by November 1st, 2024. And I think staff has that motion to put on the board. And then we'll see if I get a second.
You're making this for the council and commission?
Well, I'm making it for the council, and then there's a question as to whether this also needs to be made for the commission, because I was focused on what's needed to change the federal regulations, which would be a council action.
Okay. Tony?
Since it's a part of the FMP and the commission does have these regulations in our FMP, I think it would be wise to make a change in the FMP, in particular if any state has regulatory language that they're utilizing for these exemptions that is just linked to the FMP, then the commission's FMP would need to change.
Okay, but I'd be happy to make this a motion that would be for both the board and the council.
Adam Kowalski.
Do you want to proceed with seconds to this motion first?
Yes. Would you like to second it on behalf of?
No, I'll wait until you
Okay,
have
wait,
those
okay.
as part of the record.
All right. Joe Semino?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I'll second on behalf of the council and commission.
All right, thank you. Eric Reed?
No, I'm all set.
Adam?
So just first, I'll note that I don't believe this motion as written would be applicable to the commission. I'm assuming that this is an addendum that would be done at the commission level. So I think first we're going to have to do something with this motion. I'll also put my other question out there at this time, and that's as a result of this work, 2 administrative issues were identified, or what's been labeled as administrative issues, with discrepancies between the regulations and the FMP, one for the small mesh and one for the fly net. The presentation suggested that there was the belief that Garfo could just address these without any action here. Was that comment offered during the presentation that Garfo could address it, informed by conversation with Garfo that in fact they would address it? And if not, can we get that on the record here today as to whether Garfo does in fact intend to address those discrepancies? If not, then I think we need to take some positive action as a deliberative body.
Mike?
Yeah, I was going to offer that as part of my rationale for the framework adjustment. So there was a couple of things that I heard that I think require clarification in addition to just the definition of a fly net and the boundary. One was the 7-day enrollment, whether that enrollment for 7 days means that you can't take any trips during that period west of the line, or whether the boundary, applies during a trip. I think that is worth consideration and clarification in the action that would result from this. And then the second piece I think had to do with the discrepancy between the wording of the FMP and the wording of the regs in terms around the 1%. Is that right, Andy? And again, given that that's a discrepancy between the way the regs are written and the way the FMP was actually written, that's something we would want to explore and address in the rulemaking for the framework adjustment, and either bring the regs, make the regs in line with the FMP, or if upon further consideration, the council and board agrees that the regs are written more appropriately, then we bring the FMP into consistency. So I think both of those issues should be addressed through the framework adjustment, but within the parameters of the main intent is to clarify the definition of a fly net and to consider moving the line.
So hearing that, and given that the presentation we had suggested, and I think the words I heard was that no action was needed by the council because the belief was that Garfo would do it, I would either suggest modification through this motion to include those points specifically, or I would be willing to make that as an amendment to make sure that they're reflected here.
I think go ahead and make the amendment. That way we can definitely clarify exactly what needs to be done or what will be done.
So I would make the motion for both the board and the council to amend the motion to include language that clarifies this action will include the issue of the 1% for the fly net exemption and whether a vessel could fish west during the 7-day LOA. And I'll defer to staff or members around the council to clean that up, because I think that's probably gathers the intent here, but I think that can probably use some wordsmithing.
Kylie?
Yeah, I just wanted to check if I captured this right, but I think there was also the discrepancy in the small mesh exemption evaluation language between the FMP and the regs. So I don't know if we want to add that as well. That was vessels fishing, the evaluation being conducted on vessels fishing east of the line versus vessels fishing using the exemption program. And I can explain that more if there's need for clarification on that.
Adam?
So if perhaps it's more preferable to just trim the fat on this and just go with something to address the discrepancies highlighted in the small mesh and fly net exemption languages. Again, I'm going to defer to staff here. I came into this today with the, knowledge that from the materials that no action was needed, and here we are hearing that the recommendation from Garfo is that we take some positive action today, so I'm kind of doing this on the fly here.
Andy?
Yeah, I think not to get lost in this is the fact that, for example, with the small mesh exemption, it's all based on observer data. And that was what was available in 1993. And today we have available a lot more than just observer data that these decisions can be based off of. We actually get real landings data and discard data, for example, through the electronic vessel trip report. So, Adam, I think it's more in line with updating updating the data sources and updating the evaluation methodology. Needs to be done as part of this comprehensive framework development.
Mike Bentley?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, just to this point about the 10%, now, I mean, that to me, that's wrapped up in the 7-day issue, the enrollment period. Because the concept was that if you're enrolled in the program for a 7-day period minimum, then all trips you take while you're enrolled in the program get analyzed against the 10% threshold, presuming that all trips during that enrollment period are fished east of the line. And so it's when vessels make trips east of the line and other trips west of the line where we can't just take all trips by that vessel during the enrollment period and do the analysis for the 10%. So when we clarified that, either, all trips while you're enrolled in the program have to remain east of the line, or we decide collectively that we're going to allow trips west of the line during the enrollment period. And once we make that decision, we can determine how to characterize the analytical part for the 10%. But the way it's written right now is presumed that all trips during the enrollment period remain east of the line, so we can easily analyze those trips.
Andy?
It actually gets more convoluted than that. We don't have a way of tying the LOAs currently to the observer trips on which these decisions are being made. And so there's a series of steps that the monitoring committee goes through to assume that an observer trip is fishing under the small mesh exemption program. If we, again, update in some way the way that data is being compiled and whatnot, you could conceivably tie an LOA to a trip and have more precise information available on which to base the data. So without going through the table, and we could probably pull up the table if you wanted to, without going through the table, it's hard to describe how it's right now being done, but it's not as simple as tying an LOA to a trip.
Mike?
Yeah, I kind of want to dispute that a bit because the purpose of having an enrollment period, they request the LOA, we issue it for a 7-day period starting on the 1st, and they're enrolled from the 1st to the 7th. Any observed trips between the 1st and the 7th can clearly be tied to that LOA. And so there may be a data confidentiality issue where not everybody's able to see all the data, but I feel like if we know the enrollment period, which we do because we track these for each vessel when they're requested, then we can tie every observed trip during those enrollment periods and pull those separately for analysis. The question becomes whether that trip occurred
fully compliant with the LOA, i.e. east of the line using the gear, or was a sort of trip that was not considered by the vessel part of the LOA, part of the exemption program. And that's something that's harder to tease apart.
Kylie?
Yeah, and so this was something we started to look into as part of this review process, and the monitoring committee talked about it, and we put in a data request to start doing that. But that historically hasn't been the way that we have evaluated this. Our current practice is looking at observer data and making a series of assumptions that would kind of narrow the trips to trips that are presumed to be using the exemption. And I think, as Andy noted, there's discussion about potentially looking at new evaluation methods and new sources of data, such as explicitly looking at vessels enrolled in the LOA and looking to see if they have observer records and sort of exploring approaches like that. So we started to do that. We didn't complete that process for this evaluation.
Peter Hughes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, everybody. Is it a lack of a VMS code that's missing there? So there is a code that says, oh, there's zero VMS whatsoever? Thank you.
Adam?
So as a point of order, we've got this dangling motion here at this point. So I think it would probably be beneficial to make this an official motion here at this point. From what I heard earlier, it was the intent of the service to include these discussions in this framework addenda discussion. So as a point of order, I'd like to see this motion either become part of the record or move on.
And you are doing this for council and commission, correct?
Yes, that's correct. And I would just, to clarify this, address the discrepancies between the regulations and FMP language regarding the 1% evaluation criteria. And then add the word criteria after evaluation. And then I'll make that as the motion. Thank you.
Joe Semino?
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chair. I was going to call it back to a point of order as well, because I needed clarification. Is this just a wordier, more explanation of the motion, or is this changing the original motion?
Mike Bentley?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Adam. These were things that I had expected we would explore and address during the development of the framework adjustment and the rulemaking associated with that. So I'm happy to second these if this motion to amend is necessary, but I also reflect that my motion is to add a potential priority for the 2024 action plan. So I was trying to keep it somewhat very high level, because all we were doing is agreeing to what we were doing this morning is agreeing to tomorrow afternoon consider a new priority for 2024. So I didn't think it was necessary to get as specific as this motion is going, but if needed for everybody to feel comfortable with what we will address in that framework adjustment, I'm happy to second these and hope that the motion to amend passes, because it was part of the intent of my motion.
Kylie?
So I just wanted to clarify that the addition that you just made to the motion, the 1% evaluation, that's only applicable to the Flounder exemption. Was that your intent to remove the consideration of the discrepancy with the evaluation of the small mesh exemption program?
My intent of the motion was to address slide 27, which was the 1% evaluation criteria for rescinding the Flynet exemption. So if you'd like to add that, that would be appropriate.
Nicola?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. with the clarification that Mike just made, that his original motion was meant to capture these additional discrepancies and issues raised throughout the monitoring committee and staff recommendation documents. I'm wondering, Adam, if you would be comfortable with that, as it's been recorded on the record, that these additional issues that you've raised would be captured within the initial motion.
Adam?
I will defer to the will of the body on that one, Madam Chair.
Nicola?
I would recommend then, as the board chair, I suppose, that rather than try to get the exact language of this wording on the table, that we can just refer to the records of Mr. Pentney saying that we would address these additional issues.
So, Michelle Duval?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. No dog in this fight, but just, I think if we proceed as Nicholas suggested, then presumably that would also include examination of the prior record. As I think Adam had asked previously, it sounded like there was some examination of the record by regional office staff a little bit as this issue was being discussed, but just with respect to original intent and, regulations and as they are today, and trying to clean up the differences between the two.
Adam, are you okay with withdrawing your motion to amend?
Again, if leadership is comfortable that these two items will be considered and the record reflects that, then I don't see a need to move forward with the motion.
And Chris, you're fine with that? Okay, Mike, you're fine with that? Yep. Can we scroll back up to the first motion, please? Nicola?
Thank you, Wes. Regarding the initial motion, Adam did raise adding the word addendum to it, though, to make sure this captures the commission process. And regarding the timeline, I'm not sure if an April 2024 completion date is possible from a commission standpoint. I'm turning to Tony and she's shaking her head. I think perhaps the implementation by November 1st would work for us, but perhaps as a friendly to remove the completed by April 2024 would capture the commission's ability to stay on track with the council.
Mike?
Yeah, I'm okay with that as long as it's clear. And I look to Tony for this. Can the board and the council act separately on final action for this one? Because the council, have a motion at their April meeting, and then the board take this up at the May meeting. The reason I ask that is the reason for April is if we want rulemaking done in time for November 1 implementation, we really need to try to get the council to take final action at its April meeting. Delaying beyond that puts November 1st in jeopardy from a council perspective because of the federal rulemaking involved.
So I don't want to speak for Kylie in terms of what she can get done in time for April, but we will have to develop a document in that document will have to go out for public comment for 30 days. And I'm a little slightly off guard in terms of how much work has to be done to get the document completed. We have taken final action separately between the two management bodies before. It is not something that I recommend because if one of the bodies decides to do one thing and the other body decides to do something different, then we are not on the same track. And so I think I need to have a better understanding with staff to know how much time it'll take to develop the document to get it completed. And then I could determine when we could have a document finished by. to have a final vote on, and perhaps try to make it so that that final vote can be at the same time as that council makes recommendations to NOAA.
Chris Moore?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, thinking about the motion, one of the important words in that motion is potential. So the council hasn't approved a 2024 implementation plan yet. It will tomorrow, hopefully. So the way that I would consider this motion today is that we're adding this to the list of possible additions for consideration tomorrow. When I'm going to say, if we're going to move this up into things that we plan to do in 2024, then we're going to have to consider dropping something off. And I don't know what that's going to be. So we're going to have that conversation tomorrow. But this basically parks it into that possible addition list. In terms of the timing, I'm not, I haven't heard why it's important that this get implemented by November 1. The small mesh exemption program, the FlyNet exemption program, has been in place since the early 1990s. So if we don't get it implemented by November 1 of 2024, maybe, it moves into 2025, how big a deal is that? So I'm not sure that we need to have any dates like this at this point, but again, it's up to you all.
Mike Penny?
Yeah, thanks. And I appreciate your comment, Chris. The November 1st was in there because the exemption program runs from November 1st of each year through April 30th of the following year. So I was trying to be, reflect the industry's interest in making these changes, having them in place for the next, because we can't get them in place this year to be effective before the exemption expires on April 30th. But theoretically, we could have it in place for the start of the next exemption cycle on November 1st. So that was my intent there.
Eric Reed?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Mr. Penny. November 1st is critical. It's, this is a 30-year-old regulation. It's an administrative burden for the fishermen. And it's an unnet, you got to have a piece of paper to justify what you're doing now. We're talking about the squid fishery that happens in the winter in that little sliver between the eastern border of the Scup GRA and the coral zone. And talk about technology is changing to figure out what the data is. Well, the technology that the fishermen are using now has changed dramatically as well. One of the most common gear types that's being used in this fishery right now in that sliver is a rope net. And you've got, the wings are 8 to 10 feet long. They're not inches long, they're feet long. And typically, in one of the most common gear types, you've got 8 to 10 foot meshes. And then in the mouth of the net, you've got somewhere between 20 and 25 feet of those same meshes right behind the sweep. And the next belly panel is 32-inch meshes. And the next belly panel is 8 inches. I mean, the way fluke behave, they're going out. It's not a problem. That gear is made to catch squid. It's made to reduce bycatch of all these other fish for a lot of reasons. One, they're easy to tow. Two, they don't catch a lot of crap. And let's face it, it's hard to get a crew. So the less bycatch you have to deal with, the more likely your crew is going to stick with you because they can deal with it. So, there's a lot that has changed. I think the commercial industry really deserves to have this change. And I fully support the motion, whether or not it's completed by April or perhaps June, as long as it's implemented by November 1st of 2024, I can fully support that. Thank you.
Adam?
I will offer my support for the comments made by Mr. Reed and the motion in general to put these changes into effect. That being said, I think the motion as it's presented, we've got some additional work to do. Number one, This motion is not to initiate the framework and/or addendum. This is just to talk about having the discussion about it as a potential item. So first off, if we get there, that is a council-only discussion. The commission is not going to be part of our discussion. This board is not going to be part of the discussion tomorrow about our priority setting. So I think that's a problem with this, number one. Number two, with the timeline that's set out here, what would we actually do if this did make it to the priorities list? Would we then initiate this in February? And would we be able to call that framework meeting 1 with then completing this in April as framework meeting 2? I'm not sure how this is going to work. So before I could vote in favor of this, I'd need to have the questions resolved of how do we, as a joint motion, incorporate board discussion in what this motion seeks to do, address the work plan that the council is going to do tomorrow, and how are we going to accomplish this with the need for 2 framework meetings?
Chris Moore?
So all good points, and I haven't thought about it either. So if we have the first framework meeting in February, there's a lot of work that has to happen between now and February, obviously, to put together a framework document, or at least an initial framework document. The issue related to commission involvement, this document will be prepared largely by council staff. So, commission is going to be involved, like they always are, but the burden is going to be on the council to get this done. And again, that's why I asked earlier about these dates. November 1, 2024 implementation may be problematic for the reasons that you just articulated, which is how are we going to get this stuff done by February and then have the meeting in April? And I haven't thought a lot about it. I have no idea what kind of analyses need to occur between now and February, or actually before February, to get it into a package like between now and the beginning of February or the end of January, in order for the council to look at alternatives and make an informed decision, council and the board. So I think the first part of it, the first sentence makes sense, right? We add it as a potential, item for consideration for 2024. After that, it's a little fuzzy at this point. And there's not much I can add to it in terms of to help clarify it. So I think maybe you say in the motion that first sentence, and you say for possible implementation by November 1, 2024. And then you allow staff to work with Garfo to figure out how that might happen. I think that's all you can do today.
Mike?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. So Chris, along those lines, and I'm comfortable with your suggestion in terms of clarifying the sentence to talk about, implementation by November 1st and leaving April out, recognizing that, there will still be a pretty tight timeline to get this done. But I guess I had a question related to Adam's point about initiating, recognizing that we can't move to initiate a framework now because we have to add it to the priority list first. I guess I was sort of imagining that if we, pass this motion today and then tomorrow we agree as a council to have this be a priority for 2024. And once we make that decision, could that be almost immediately followed by a motion to initiate the framework so that the February meeting can be the first noticed framework meeting?
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes. Yes. Yeah, we could do that.
Tony Kearns?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I see this motion as the board and the board and the council working together to state that the commission, if this becomes a priority for the council, then that we would be working together on the document to move forward. the board would still have to initiate an addendum to work on this action. We would have to add it to our 2024 priority list. And thank you, Chris. I think it would be wonderful if council staff could do the work on this, but we would also help out where we can, if possible. And that's why I didn't want to speak for Kylie in terms of the amount of time, but we would still have to do those public hearings, as I indicated before, in order to make that change. And so I just know that April is definitely not a possibility in terms of if we were going to take action together for the final decision, that would not be possible for the commission, no matter, I think, no matter how fast Kylie moves.
Nicola?
Thank you. So to help possibly clarify what Adam raised about the commission process, if this motion were approved for the board, it would be asking for the policy board and at their next meeting in February to revise the previously approved action plan for 2024 to include this, and then for the Fluke Scup CBAS board to initiate a document in February as well. All right, I'm seeing heads nodding, so thank you.
Chris Savage?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I can support considering this as a priority for next year. I think we heard the importance of revisiting both of these programs, from industry and at the monitoring committee meeting, as they've been in place for a long time. I'm not going to repeat the concerns over the timing of having this in place by 2024, but it from the conversation, I think makes it clear that there's a more of a priority or urgency to address these issues for the small mesh exemption program sooner rather than later, as opposed to getting a better definition for the Flynet exemption program, which, again, that might take a little bit of time, because we've kind of learned as we've had these meetings of the nuances of these nets. And a high-rise net is essentially a fly net. Just they're fished in different places and have slightly different net configurations, because the way the regulations are written is very specific to the fishery that was occurring really by North Carolina and probably some Virginia boats targeting a suite of species. But to expand that exemption program, I suspect you'll be adding black sea bass and scup to it as well. And then it's going to raise the question that I had during one of the meetings is, how are we going to monitor this? Because if this does become kind of a broader fishery, then using North Carolina trip ticket data for stuff recorded as fly nets is not going to cover what we need in order to monitor this fishery. We're going to really need to figure out where those other sources of data are going to come from. And from a timing issue, I suspect that's probably going to take the FMAT some time to try to figure out how best to do that, because once we approve this, we're going to need to have a plan on as to how we're going to monitor it. So anyways, thanks.
It's for the maker of the motion, and Mike, and for also Joe seconded. I guess we need to kind of clean it up a little bit to possibly on the last sentence, I guess would say the intent of this framework / addendum is for possible implementation by November 1st and get rid of to be completed by April 2024.
And I'm happy to make that change as a friendly amendment. I think that's consistent with Chris's comment. But again, I'll just restate that I think, if we're going to achieve November 1st, council action in April, because we were just looking at what the timeline would have to be from a June council decision to November 1st, and it's just not workable. So it's going to have to be completed in April if we're going to have a chance at November 1st.
Joe, are you okay with this?
Yes, yeah, I am. And I guess while I have the mic, Nicola laid out the next probably 2 board meetings, but I was curious if we thought we were close enough, if the April council meeting could just be joint to finish this off. It's in the lovely state of New Jersey. I figure everybody would like to visit Atlantic City.
There you go. Chris Moore.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an option. Virtual option is another possibility. Just have a joint, board council meeting for 2 hours and deal with it.
Any more questions or comments on the motion? Dan?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, to Chris's point, if it's determined that the definition of a fly net is going to bog this framework addendum down, is it possible to just continue with the moving the western boundary of the small mesh exemption area as a standalone? Or are they both tied in together if they come a priority, tomorrow? How does that work?
Chris?
Thanks. So there is some intersection. Andy posed the question to the council, which is, if you define a fly net right way, whatever the right way is, then maybe you don't need a small mesh exemption program. So they're kind of intertwined, but I see your point as well, that if we go down this path and it's, maybe we're talking about all midwater trawls exempted, I don't know. Then, and that bogs us down. Maybe we just move to the small mesh exemption thing. Again, it's hard to say until we see a package and look at the alternatives. But yeah, think about that intersection that Andy brought up, because it's a good point. Fly nets and small mesh exemption.
All right, with that, we're going to go ahead and call a vote on the motion. Since this is council and commission, we're going to be alternating votes. We're going to start off with the council. All those, I guess we kind of changed it, so I'm going to go ahead and read it into the minutes. I move to consider as a potential 2024 priority a framework adjustment / addendum to clarify the definition of a fly net and to consider moving the western boundary of the small mesh exemption area. The intent of this framework / addendum is for possible implementation by November 1st, 2024. All those in favor for the council, please raise your hands online. Do it online, please. Okay. Okay, everybody put their hands down. We have 19. All those opposed, raise your hand. Seeing none, any abstentions? Motion carries 19-0-1. Nicola?
Thank you. We'll move on to the board. Is there a need to caucus among states? Please raise your hand if anyone needs a moment to caucus. Not seeing any hands, so we'll see if we can do this the easy way. Is there any objection to the motion? Again, raising your hands online. Seeing none, the motion carries unanimously from the board. Any abstentions, should ask? Okay. Carries unanimously. Thank you.
Tony?
I just want to note that our policy board will discuss this in January. Right now, we don't have a summer flounder scup black sea bass board meeting in January. I'll talk to Bob and our chairman and determine whether or not we will add a summer flounder scup black sea bass board, or if we will have the policy board take up this issue of initiating a document depending on how tomorrow goes. I just want to put that out there for the public and the board members, that it may be during the policy board discussion that we would initiate the addendum.
Andy or Kylie, do you have anything else to bring before us?
I don't think so.
All right, with that, thank you very much. Looks like we're gonna have a long lunch, which going next door, it's gonna take a while to figure out what we want to eat anyway, normally. When you come back, people that are having trouble online, if you go to the notary conference site, for your internet and then punch in Superior, I will get Stephen to put that up. You'll get a lot better internet. With that, we'll adjourn till 1 o'clock.